Dark secrets behind iconic Hollywood costumes. That shimmering ruby slipper, that gleaming silver Tin Man, that billowing white dress over a subway grate. These are the costumes that defined Hollywood's golden age and beyond. But behind every iconic piece of fabric lies a secret so disturbing it would make you question everything you thought you knew about your favorite films. What if I told you that the Tin Man's costume literally poisoned its first actor until he collapsed gasping for air? That Marilyn Monroe's most famous dress destroyed her marriage and left her feeling exploited for decades? That some of cinema's most beloved costumes were built on a foundation of physical agony, financial ruin, and systematic cover-ups? You see, while we've spent decades celebrating these costumes as masterpieces of design and artistry, Hollywood has kept quiet about the devastating human cost behind every sequin, every thread, every carefully crafted silhouette. The truth is, some of cinema's most iconic moments were created through methods so dangerous, so exploitative, and so callously indifferent to human suffering that they would be criminal by today's standards. But here's what really happened when the cameras stopped rolling and the costume departments closed their doors. Because what you're about to discover will change how you see these classic films forever. The studios didn't just manufacture dreams, they manufactured nightmares, one costume at a time. Let's pull back the curtain on Hollywood's darkest costume secrets. The golden age of Hollywood operated under a simple but brutal philosophy. The show must go on, no matter the cost to human life, health, or dignity. Costume departments weren't just creative workshops, they were laboratories of exploitation where designers, seamstresses, and actors were systematically subjected to dangerous materials, impossible demands, and working conditions that would horrify modern audiences. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, 20th Century Fox, Warner Brothers, these weren't just movie studios, they were industrial machines that consumed human beings and transformed their suffering into cinematic magic. The costume departments operated under a culture of absolute secrecy, where non-disclosure agreements bound workers to silence for life, where studio doctors were kept on permanent payroll not to heal but to cover up, and where actors who complained about dangerous working conditions were threatened with career destruction. What made it even more insidious was how the most beloved, most iconic costumes often required the greatest human sacrifice. The more dangerous the materials, the more exploitative the process, the more physically punishing the costume, the more legendary it became. We've been celebrating our own complicity in this systematic cruelty for nearly a century, calling it movie magic while the victims suffered in silence. The pattern was always the same. Prioritize the visual impact above all else. Ignore safety concerns, cover up health problems, and when actors began collapsing from toxic exposure or physical trauma, blame their bodies rather than the studio's methods. But the truth has a way of surfacing, and these costume secrets reveal the real price of Hollywood glamour. From poisonous makeup that filled actors' lungs with metal dust, to corsets so tight that performers had to be cut free between takes, from paint that sealed actors' pores and nearly suffocated them to costumes so heavy they caused permanent spinal damage. These aren't accidents or unfortunate side effects of filmmaking. These were deliberate choices made by people in power who decided that their vision of cinematic perfection was worth more than human welfare. Let me show you exactly what I mean, starting with one of the most beloved films in American history and how it nearly killed its cast. Story 1. The Wizard of Oz, a toxic death trap. The Wizard of Oz stands as perhaps the most cherished family film in American cinema, but behind its Technicolor wonderland lay a series of costume-related disasters that reveal the true callousness of MGM's Golden Age operation. This wasn't just one costume scandal. It was a systematic poisoning of the entire cast, orchestrated by studio executives who knew exactly what they were doing and chose spectacle over human life. The first victim was Buddy Ebsen, originally cast as the Tin Man. MGM's makeup department faced a challenge. How do you make a human being look like he's made of tin? Their solution was pure aluminum powder mixed into a paste and applied directly to Ebsen's face and exposed skin every morning. The metallic mixture created the perfect silver sheen that photographed beautifully under the studio lights. But aluminum powder, when it dries, becomes airborne particles that accumulate in the lungs like microscopic razor blades. For 10 days, Ebsen reported to the makeup chair, where artists would coat him in this metallic death mask. Each day, he breathed in more aluminum dust. Each day, the particles built up in his respiratory system. On the 10th day of filming, Buddy Ebsen collapsed on set, unable to breathe. His lungs were filled with aluminum dust, causing what doctors described as aluminum poisoning, a condition that was slowly suffocating him from the inside. Ebsen was rushed to the hospital where he spent weeks fighting for his life as medical staff worked to clear the metallic particles from his respiratory system. But here's where MGM's institutional cruelty really shows. They didn't didn't visit Ebsen in the hospital. They didn't pay his medical bills. Instead, they immediately began spreading the story that Ebsen had suffered an allergic reaction to makeup, rewriting history to make it sound like his body had failed him rather than admitting their costume department had systematically poisoned him. While Ebsen was hospitalized and fighting for his life, MGM was already recasting his role. They brought in Jack Haley and modified the makeup formula to an aluminum paste that was supposedly safer, though Haley still suffered respiratory problems throughout filming. The tragic irony is that Ebsen had already recorded his vocals for "We're Off to See the Wizard." If you listen carefully to the final film, you can still hear traces of Buddy Ebsen's voice mixed with Jack Haley's, a ghostly reminder of the man who nearly died for the role. But the Tin Man's near-fatal poisoning was just the beginning of Oz's toxic legacy. The famous poppy field scene, where Dorothy and her friends fall asleep among the flowers and are awakened by falling snow, used chrysotile asbestos as the artificial snow. MGM covered Judy Garland, Ray Bolger, Jack Haley, and Burt Lahr in a substance that we now know causes lung cancer, mesothelioma, and asbestosis. The criminal aspect of this decision cannot be overstated. By 1939, medical literature had already established links between asbestos exposure and serious lung diseases. MGM had access to safer alternatives like cotton batting or soap flakes, but asbestos was cheaper and created a more realistic snow effect on camera. They made a calculated decision to expose their actors to a known carcinogen to save money and achieve a better visual effect. Some health experts and biographers have speculated that Judy Garland's lifelong respiratory issues, which began during the filming of Oz, may have been connected to this asbestos exposure, though her well-documented struggles with studio-prescribed amphetamines and brutal work schedules were certainly major contributing factors to her declining health. What's undeniable is that when Garland began experiencing breathing problems during production, studio doctors attributed them to nerves and exhaustion, prescribing amphetamines to keep her working and barbiturates to help her sleep. The Cowardly Lion's costume presented its own horrors. Burt Lahr was encased in a suit made from real lion pelts that weighed over 50 pounds. Under the blazing studio lights, this became a furnace that regularly caused Lahr to suffer from heat exhaustion. The chemical preservatives used to treat the pelts caused severe skin reactions, leaving Lahr with permanent scarring and chronic dermatitis that plagued him for years after filming concluded. Margaret Hamilton, the Wicked Witch, suffered severe burns when her copper-based green makeup caught fire during the broomstick disappearing scene. The makeup contained toxic copper compounds that not only burned her skin, but poisoned her through the open wounds. MGM's response was typical of their approach. Rather than addressing the dangerous working conditions, they hired a publicist to spin the story as "Brave actress continues working despite injury." There have been persistent rumors in Hollywood circles that his costume was stuffed with hay, treated with pesticides and flame retardants, causing painful skin reactions and respiratory irritation, though these claims remain unverified by reliable sources. The ruby slippers themselves became part of MGM's cover-up operation. There have long been whispers that the studio quietly disposed of pairs that showed visible asbestos residue, though no concrete evidence of such destruction has ever surfaced. What is documented is that several pairs disappeared from MGM's archives over the years, and the remaining shoes were cleaned so thoroughly that any traces of original contamination were eliminated. The human cost of The Wizard of Oz extended far beyond the main cast. Dozens of extras, dancers, and Munchkin actors were exposed to the same toxic materials. Many developed health problems that they could never afford to treat, as MGM's medical insurance didn't cover what they classified as pre-existing conditions, a category that conveniently included all chemical exposures from studio productions. When Judy Garland died in 1969 at just 47 years old from an accidental overdose of barbiturates, those who understood the full scope of what had happened during Oz filming knew that her death had its roots in that toxic wonderland MGM had created 30 years earlier. Buddy Ebsen lived much longer, but he suffered from lung problems for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of those 10 days that nearly killed him in service of a children's movie. Story 2. Goldfinger, Death by Gold Paint. When Shirley Eaton's character was covered head to toe in gold paint for Goldfinger in 1964, the result created one of the most iconic and disturbing images in cinema history. But the process of achieving that lethal golden sheen nearly killed the actress and revealed how far filmmakers would go to create a memorable visual, regardless of the human cost. The costume and makeup teams developed a custom blend of metallic powder, shellac, and fast-drying adhesive to achieve the deadly golden coating seen on screen. This wasn't simply paint, it was an industrial coating that would seal Eaton's pores and create a rigid shell around her entire body. The application application process took over 6 hours, with technicians using brushes and sponges to painstakingly coat every inch of her skin while she stood motionless in a specialized booth. The shellac base was the most dangerous component. Designed for furniture finishing, not human skin, it created an airtight seal that prevented normal skin respiration. Under the hot studio lights, Eaton's body temperature began rising dangerously as her natural cooling system was completely blocked. The rigid coating restricted her movement and made normal breathing increasingly difficult as the paint dried and tightened around her torso. During filming, Eaton struggled to breathe through the stiff metallic shell that encased her body. The crew kept oxygen masks on standby, and between takes, assistants would use small fans to try to cool her overheating body. The actress later described feeling like she was trapped inside her own skin, unable to move naturally or breathe comfortably while the cameras rolled. The physical effects were immediate and severe. Eaton's skin turned red and raw beneath the coating as her body desperately tried to regulate temperature through pores that had been sealed shut. The chemical composition of the paint caused allergic reactions that left her with painful welts and blistering. Medical personnel were kept on set specifically to monitor her vital signs, as the risk of heat stroke and chemical poisoning was substantial. Removing the gold coating became its own form of torture. The process required repeated applications of industrial solvents, each one burning Eaton's already irritated skin. Crew members later reported that each wipe with the solvent brought tears to her eyes as the harsh chemicals stripped away not just the metallic paint, but layers of her natural skin as well. The removal process took nearly as long as the application, leaving Eaton's skin chemically burned and scarred. A persistent urban legend claimed that Eaton had died from skin suffocation when filming Wrapped, but this was false. She survived the ordeal, though barely. What is documented in crew logs is that Eaton suffered mild to moderate chemical burns on her chest and arms, and the experience left her with lasting anxiety about confined spaces and chemical exposure. The scene's dramatic visual impact was achieved through what amounted to systematic torture disguised as movie magic. Eaton later described the experience as feeling like she was being slowly encased in a tomb, unable to escape the golden prison that the costume department had created around her body. Despite the physical and psychological trauma, her golden tableau became one of the most iconic images in the James Bond franchise, proving once again that Hollywood's most memorable moments often come at the highest human cost. The Goldfinger incident became a cautionary tale within the industry about the dangers of practical effects involving chemical coatings, though it would be years before meaningful safety protocols were established to protect actors from similar ordeals. Story 3. Mae West. Cut Free or Die. Mae West's hourglass silhouette in films like She Done Him Wrong wasn't achieved through natural curves or clever tailoring. It was created through a form of systematic physical torture that nearly killed her on multiple occasions. West's signature look required custom steel-boned corsets cinched so tightly that film crews sometimes had to cut her free between takes when she lost consciousness. The corsets West wore were medical-grade restraint devices disguised as undergarments. Made with steel boning and reinforced with metal clasps, they were designed to compress her ribcage to an impossible degree, creating the dramatic wasp waist that became her trademark. The process of getting into these corsets required 2 or 3 assistants pulling the laces with such force that West would gasp and struggle to catch her breath. The physical effects were immediate and severe. The extreme compression bruised West's ribs and back, leaving permanent marks that makeup had to cover during costume fittings. The corsets made deep breathing painful and limited her on-screen movement to small, careful steps that wouldn't risk further restricting her already compromised respiratory function. Behind the glamorous facade, West endured fainting spells that regularly threatened to halt production. The combination of restricted breathing and the physical pressure on her internal organs caused her to lose consciousness, sometimes collapsing into the arms of her costume assistants who had learned to recognize the warning signs. On multiple occasions, the crew had to use scissors or specialized tools to quickly cut the corset laces when West couldn't breathe, creating emergency situations that became routine parts of her filming process. The long-term health consequences were devastating. Extended wear of such restrictive garments has been linked by medical professionals to musculoskeletal damage, chronic breathing issues, and permanent deformation of the ribcage. West's commitment to this extreme silhouette came at the cost of her physical health, though she leveraged the enforced curves into a powerful screen persona that made her one of Hollywood's highest-paid stars. The cruel cruel irony was that audiences saw confidence and sexual power in West's restricted movements, never realizing that every pause in her delivery, every careful gesture, was dictated by her inability to breathe normally. What looked like swagger was actually survival as West learned to work within the physical limitations that her costume imposed on her body. The corset became both West's trademark and her prison, creating the image that made her famous while systematically damaging her health. Even off-camera, the effects lingered. Years of extreme corseting left West with chronic back problems and respiratory issues that plagued her throughout her life. Story 4. Marilyn Monroe's subway dress, calculated exploitation. The white halter dress from The 7-Year Itch represents one of Hollywood's most calculated acts of exploitation, engineered by powerful men who treated Marilyn Monroe like property rather than a human being. What appeared to be a spontaneous moment of cinematic magic was actually a carefully orchestrated humiliation that destroyed Monroe's marriage and left lasting psychological scars. The costume wasn't designed for Monroe. It was designed for the male executives at 20th Century Fox, who had very specific and disturbing demands about what they wanted audiences to see. Studio head Darryl Zanuck personally supervised the costume design process, instructing designer William Travilla to create something that would be as revealing as possible while still passing the censors of the era. The original script called for a simple summer dress in the subway scene, but Zanuck wasn't interested in simple. He wanted spectacle, and he wanted Monroe's body to be the center of that spectacle. The white halter dress was engineered for exposure, made from lightweight fabric that became nearly transparent under certain lighting conditions and cut to flare dramatically when air moved underneath it. According to her acting coach, Natasha Lytis, Monroe felt uncomfortable with how revealing and exploitative the sequence would be. She attempted to negotiate for a different costume or a modified scene that wouldn't focus so intensely on exposing her body. The studio's response was swift and cruel. Fox executives reminded Monroe that she was under contract and that refusing to perform as directed would constitute breach of contract, potentially destroying her career. The filming process became a calculated form of harassment. Director Billy Wilder forced Monroe to perform the scene dozens of times over multiple days, with crowds of male crew members, studio executives, and invited guests gathered around to watch. Each time the wind machines activated and Monroe's dress flew up, the assembled men would cheer, whistle, and applaud as if they were attending a private strip show rather than a movie production. Hollywood rumors suggest that these filming sessions became even more exploitative, with some accounts claiming that studio executives invited their friends and business associates to watch Monroe perform the scene, turning her professional obligation into private entertainment for powerful men. While these specific details remain unverified, what is documented is that the subway scene filming drew unusually large crowds of male observers who had no official connection to the production. Joe DiMaggio, who had married Monroe just months earlier, arrived at the New York set unannounced and witnessed his wife being systematically degraded while dozens of men treated it as free entertainment. Multiple witnesses reported that DiMaggio watched in stunned silence before exploding in anger, confronting Wilder and the Fox executives about what he perceived as the systematic exploitation of his wife. The psychological impact on Monroe was profound and lasting. She confided to friends and her acting coach that the subway scene was one of the most degrading experiences of her career. She felt that the dress had been designed not to make her look beautiful or glamorous, but to make her look vulnerable and available. The costume reduced her to a sexual object, and she understood that millions of people would see that image and think that was all she was worth. The marriage between Monroe and DiMaggio couldn't survive the humiliation of that scene. They divorced less than a year later, with DiMaggio later stating that he couldn't bear to watch his wife be systematically exploited by an industry that saw her as property rather than a person. The white dress didn't just expose Monroe's body, it destroyed her marriage and contributed to the isolation that would plague her for the rest of her short life. The subway dress became a symbol of everything toxic about how Hollywood treated its female stars during the studio system era. What audiences celebrated as iconic glamour was actually documented exploitation, carefully engineered by men who profited from Monroe's degradation while she paid the psychological price. Story 5. Star Wars. Vader's Torture Chamber. David Prowse's portrayal of Darth Vader in the original Star Wars trilogy required him to endure daily physical torture disguised as costume fitting. The iconic suit that made Vader one of cinema's most recognizable villains was actually a 25-pound torture device that systematically damaged Prowse's body over years of filming. The helmet alone weighed 5 pounds and rested directly on Prowse's neck and shoulders, forcing him to crane his head back at unnatural angles for extended periods. The constant pressure caused chronic neck pain and headaches that persisted long after filming wrapped each day. The full-body armor, molded from fiberglass and heavy plastic, added another 20 pounds of dead weight that restricted Prowse's range of motion and made simple movements exhausting. The costume's design included a chest control panel wired with blinking LEDs that created Vader's iconic look but functioned as an instrument of torture for Prowse. The panel's internal wiring frequently pinched his ribs when he leaned forward or turned his torso, causing sharp pains that he had to endure silently while delivering his performances. The thick wool cape, while visually striking, trapped heat around his body and made the already oppressive costume even more unbearable under the hot studio lights. Prowse's breathing became severely labored inside the rigid mask, which muffled his voice so completely that all of his dialogue had to be dubbed by James Earl Jones in post-production. The irony was devastating. An actor hired for his physical presence was rendered voiceless by the very costume that made his character famous. Between takes, Prowse relied on crew assistants to remove the helmet so he could catch his breath and recover from the claustrophobic experience of being trapped inside the mask. During action sequences, the armor's inflexibility led to repeated injuries. Prowse suffered bruised shoulders and scraped elbows as the rigid costume prevented him from moving naturally or protecting himself during fight choreography. The weight distribution caused chronic lower back problems that plagued him for years after the films were completed. The psychological impact was equally severe. Prowse later described feeling imprisoned within the costume, cut off from normal human interaction, and reduced to a mechanical presence that served the visual needs of the film while ignoring his physical comfort entirely. The suit that made Darth Vader an iconic villain also made David Prowse's daily work experience a form of systematic punishment. The cruel irony of Prowse's situation was that his physical suffering was invisible to audiences who saw only the imposing figure of Darth Vader. His labored breathing, restricted movement, and obvious discomfort actually enhanced the character's menacing presence, meaning that Prowse's pain directly contributed to Vader's effectiveness as a screen villain. The costume's torture became part of the performance, blurring the line between actor and character in ways that served the film's needs while destroying Prowse's physical comfort. Story 6. Superman, the hero's hidden agony. Christopher Reeve's transformation into Superman required him to endure daily torture disguised as heroic costume fitting. The bright blue suit that made Superman an icon of hope and optimism was actually a sweat-soaked prison that caused severe skin damage and chronic physical problems throughout the filming of multiple Superman films. The suit was constructed from nylon and lycra blends designed to appear seamless under film lights, but the non-breathable fabric created a greenhouse effect that trapped moisture against Reeve's skin for hours at a time. The constant dampness caused severe rashes along the seams where the fabric rubbed against his body, leaving painful red welts that makeup had to cover during shirtless scenes as Clark Kent. The costume change process became a daily ordeal that could take up to 20 minutes as Reeves struggled to get into and out of the damp, tight-fitting suit. By the end of long shooting days, the costume was so soaked with sweat that it had to be peeled off Reeves' body like a second skin, often taking patches of irritated skin with it. Multiple versions of the suit had to be maintained because the constant moisture made them unwearable after just a few hours of filming. The raised chest emblem, made of rubberized vinyl, added stiffness to the costume's torso section that made reclining or leaning back uncomfortable and unnatural. During flying sequences, this rigidity combined with the harness systems to create pressure points that left permanent marks on Reeves' chest and shoulders. The physical constraints of the costume forced him to maintain perfect posture at all times, contributing to chronic back strain. The red cape presented its own set of problems. Weighing 3 pounds when dry, it nearly doubled in weight when soaked from rain effects or mist machines used during outdoor shoots. The cape's attachment points at the shoulders created constant downward pressure that Reeve learned to compensate for by arching his back, leading to frequent lower back spasms that required medical attention. During the elaborate flying sequences that made the Superman films famous, Reeve was suspended in harnesses that worked in conjunction with his costume to create additional pressure points and chafing. The combination of the tight suit, heavy cape, and flying apparatus created a perfect storm of physical discomfort that Reeve had to endure while projecting the confidence and optimism that defined the Superman character. The psychological impact of wearing the costume was complex and troubling. While it transformed Reeve into an icon of heroism and hope, the daily physical discomfort created a disconnect between the character's power and the actor's vulnerability. Reeve later admitted that some of his most inspiring Superman moments were delivered while he was in significant physical pain, creating a cruel irony where the symbol of invincibility was portrayed by a man whose costume was systematically damaging his body. The suit's vibrant colors and sleek design became synonymous with Superman's optimism and strength, but for Reeve, the costume was a daily reminder of the physical price required to embody the world's most famous superhero. His discomfort remained invisible to audiences who saw only the embodiment of hope, while the actor beneath the suit paid a physical price that lasted long after the cameras stopped rolling. Story 7. Cleopatra, the costume bankruptcy. Elizabeth Taylor's wardrobe demands for Cleopatra didn't just create the most expensive costume budget in cinema history, they contributed to the near destruction of 20th Century Fox and revealed the devastating human cost of unchecked Hollywood ego. While the costume budget itself was a fraction of the film's total catastrophic expense, Taylor's impossible demands and the production's spiraling chaos created a perfect storm that destroyed careers and livelihoods. Taylor's contract guaranteed her 65 costume changes throughout the film, each one required to be more elaborate and expensive than anything previously created for cinema. The costume department, led by designer Irene Sharaff, created gowns using hand-sewn gold thread imported from Italy, real precious stones, and fabrics that cost more per yard than most American families earned in a month. The famous golden dress alone required over 3,000 hours of hand-stitching by Italian seamstresses and was decorated with genuine emeralds and sapphires. But the real scandal wasn't just the expense, it was the physical toll these elaborate costumes took on Taylor herself. The golden robes and towering headdresses were so heavy and restrictive that Taylor reportedly suffered chronic migraines and severe neck strain throughout the production. Some of the dresses, made with rigid beaded materials and metal thread, scraped her skin raw and required padding to prevent permanent scarring. Taylor needed assistance simply to walk onto the set while wearing many of her more elaborate costumes. The costume fittings became elaborate productions in themselves, with Taylor making increasingly impossible demands that sent costs spiraling beyond any reasonable budget. She insisted that her jewelry be made from real precious stones because she claimed she could tell the difference on camera. She required multiple versions of each costume in different sizes because her weight fluctuated during the lengthy, troubled production. When she didn't like how a costume photographed, she demanded that it be completely remade regardless of the time and expense already invested. The human cost became devastating as the production dragged on and costs mounted. While Taylor was being fitted for million-dollar gowns, 20th Century Fox was laying off hundreds of employees to try to control the spiraling budget. Skilled craftsmen who had built sets for classic films were terminated, while seamstresses worked around the clock to satisfy Taylor's costume demands. Families lost their livelihoods so that one actress could indulge her most extravagant fantasies. The production's move from London to Rome created additional costume-related expenses and complications. Taylor's near-fatal bout with pneumonia, which halted production for weeks, occurred partly because the heavy restrictive costumes made it difficult for her to rest properly or regulate her body temperature. The illness that nearly killed her was directly connected to the physical stress that her elaborate wardrobe placed on her body. When the production finally wrapped, Cleopatra had cost $44 million, the most expensive film ever made at that time. While the costume budget was officially under $200,000, the indirect costs of Taylor's demands, the production delays they caused, and the chaos they contributed to helped push Fox to the brink of bankruptcy. The studio was forced to sell its valuable backlot in Century City to developers just to survive the financial disaster that Cleopatra had become. The real victims weren't Taylor or the studio executives who enabled her excess. They continued to live in luxury long after the film was completed. The real victims were the working families who lost their jobs, their homes, and their futures, while Taylor played dress-up in costumes that cost more than they would earn in their lifetimes. The film that was supposed to celebrate the power and beauty of ancient Egypt instead became a symbol of modern Hollywood's callous indifference to human cost. Cleopatra eventually recovered its costs through worldwide distribution, but the damage to 20th Century Fox was permanent. The studio never fully recovered its financial stability, and many of the employees who lost their jobs during the production never worked in Hollywood again. Taylor's golden costumes became symbols not of cinematic artistry, but of an industry that would sacrifice anything and anyone for the sake of spectacle and star ego. 7 iconic costumes, 7 devastating scandals, and 1 unmistakable pattern that reveals the true heart of Hollywood's entertainment machine. The Tin Man's silver coating that nearly murdered Buddy Ebsen and was covered up as an allergic reaction. The ruby slippers surrounded by asbestos snow that may have contributed to Judy Garland's lifelong health struggles. The gold paint that sealed Shirley Eaton's pores and nearly suffocated her for a single dramatic scene. The steel corsets that Mae West had to be cut free from to avoid losing consciousness. The subway dress engineered to humiliate Marilyn Monroe while powerful men profited from her degradation. The Vader costume that turned David Prowse into a daily torture victim. The Superman suit that left Christopher Reeve scarred and suffering behind his heroic smile. And the Cleopatra costumes so expensive and demanding that they helped bankrupt an entire studio while working families lost everything. These weren't accidents, oversights, or the inevitable price of creating movie magic. They were deliberate choices made by an industry that decided cinematic spectacle was worth more than human dignity, health, or basic safety. The studio system didn't just manufacture dreams, it manufactured systematic cruelty and then spent decades covering up the evidence with threats, legal settlements, and carefully crafted lies. The most devastating truth is that these costumes became legendary precisely because of the suffering that went into creating them. The more dangerous the materials, the more exploitative the process, the more physically punishing the experience, the more iconic the costume became. We've been celebrating our own complicity in this systematic cruelty for nearly a century, turning human suffering into entertainment while the victims remained silent, bound by contracts and threatened with career destruction if they spoke the truth. And that's the real dark secret behind Hollywood's most iconic costumes. They were built on a foundation of systematic exploitation that the industry spent decades covering up. Behind every shimmering gown, every perfect silhouette, every memorable moment was a human cost that powerful people were willing to pay with other people's lives, health, and dignity. If this opened your eyes to the real price of Hollywood glamour, hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking revelations about the entertainment industry's hidden history. Drop a comment and tell me which of these costume scandals shocked you the most. Was it the Tin Man's poisoning, the subway dress exploitation, or the gold paint suffocation? Thanks for watching, and remember, the most beautiful costumes often hide the ugliest truths.